coming out. I'm Walter Johnson. I'm the director of the Warren Center. I just want to announce a couple of events before turning it over to Lorgia. First thing I should do is to thank my staff, Arthur Patton Hawk and Monique McCall, Jackie Wheeler. I made this joke the other day, nobody got it, so let's see if you guys got it. I said I've become the Miss Frizzle of American academia. Nobody gets it. So it's sort of like, okay, today let's do this. And then they put the events together. So it's amazing the work they've done, and I'm really grateful to them. And you guys obviously need to spend more time watching the Magic School Bus. I want to announce two events. Which will be, I swear I won't make that joke again. Word, Sound, and Struggle, hip-hop, spoken word, and the fight for brown and black lives. That's on April 5th. That is going to be from 5 to 10 in the evening in the Psy Auditorium in the basement of CJA South. And we are going to have hip-hop artists and activists from all over the world. Well, you could say all over the world because we have somebody coming from the UK and Palestine, but really from all over the United States. But folks who work against anti-Asian racism, anti-black racism, against Islamophobia, and anti-imperialist struggle in Palestine and the UK and the United States. So this will be an extraordinary event. It's going to be a combination of a cappella performances, spoken word, and real talk. So I really commend that to you. 5 to 7, then a buffet with an open mic. So if any of you really want to perform, and then I'm going to be up there doing some stand-up about Miss Frizzle. And then 8 to 10. Okay, that's on April the 5th. And then another event sponsored by the American Studies Program, Climate Change, Indigenous Resistance, and Forging a New Democracy. Thoughts for the Present Moment. Winona LaDuke is going to be here. These are 3 lectures at the beginning of May, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And they are, the ones on the 1st and the 2nd are at 5:30 in the evening, in the afternoon. And then the one on the 3rd is at 4:30. It's very helpfully listed on the poster as 4:30 parentheses, not 5:30. So do try to make all of those events. But I want to turn it over now to Lorgia Garcia Peña, who has really put this extraordinary event together, Undocumented Knowledge, Students, Borders, and the Politics of Sanctuary. So I am, along with my gratitude to the Warren Center staff, enormously grateful to Lorgia for this and everything else she's done this year at Harvard.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to Undocumented Knowledge, Students, Borders, and the Politics of Sanctuary. I want to echo Walter's thanks to Monique and Arthur, who really did a fantastic job in getting us all here today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Weatherhead Center, the Ethnicity, Migration Rights, Romance Languages and Literatures, and History and Literature for your support. The idea for this panel came from a conversation that Walter and I had around Christmas following the student activism that emerged last fall here at Harvard around 3 issues: the dining hall workers' strike, the continued absence of ethnic studies at any kind of ethnic studies program at Harvard, and the urgent need for the university to create a specific initiative and a response to protect and support its undocumented students in this anti-immigrant, racist, homophobic, plainly scary political climate. So the 3 issues that though seemingly different transverse in very tangible ways through the lives of many of our first-generation students and faculty of color at Harvard. And it was not very hard for some of us to see, for instance, how the lack of ethnic studies made it difficult for the undocumented community to find a home at Harvard, or how for many of these first-generation students who come from working and immigrant families such as mine, it was simply to identify with the dining hall workers. The ways in which my students of Performing Latinidad, some of which are here today, last fall connected in and out of the classroom their intellectual inquiries to tangible actions that had an impact in their own community here at Harvard, and if I may say, walk everybody up just a little bit more, was not only heroic, it was a manifestation of what Jonathan Lear calls radical hope. And Lear says, and I'm going to quote very briefly, "What makes this hope radical is that it is directed toward a future goodness that transcends the current ability to understand what it is." Radical hope is not so much something you have, but something you practice. It demands flexibility, openness, and what Lear calls imaginative excellence. And most importantly, radical hope, as my friend Junot Diaz says, and I quote, "is our best weapon against despair, even when despair seems justifiable, as in these times." So it has been a true honor for me to put together this panel of people who hope radically. When thinking about who to invite, I talked to students. I asked them about who they would like to hear from and what kinds of questions they wanted to be addressed. So our panel hopes to provoke today a transnational, interdisciplinary, and intersectional conversation about immigration, widely defined to include the experiences of the undocumented, immigrants, refugees, and people who identified as second generation or descendants of immigrants, in dialogue with the university as a sanctuary, or rather as a site for radical hoping. So each of our speakers today will have about 15 minutes to introduce their own work within their own disciplines, and at the end of the presentation, we will open it up for discussion amongst the panelists and with you all. So the idea is that we'll have enough time for a conversation with everyone, because I think we're all eager to hear from you also. So I will first introduce all the panelists together so that I don't have to keep interrupting, and then we'll go to each presentation and finally the questions. So our first panelist is Lisa Lowe, who's a professor of English and Humanities at Tufts University, where she directs the Center for Humanities and teaches in the Consortium for Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. Before moving to Tufts in 2012, she was located in California and taught for many years at the University of California in San Diego. She works on race, immigration, colonialism, globalization, and her works include Immigrant Acts on Asian American Cultural Politics, The Politics of Culture in the Shadow of Capital, and The Intimacies of Four Continents, which is my favorite book. I'm such a fan. Our second panelist, Maurice Stierl, is a visiting assistant professor in comparative and border studies at the University of California, Davis, and is associated with cultural studies in African American and African studies. His research focuses on immigration, border struggles in contemporary Europe, and is broadly situated in the disciplines of international relations, international political sociology, and migration, citizenship, and border studies. Maurice's work has appeared in numerous journals, including Antipode, Globalizations, Global Society, and Citizenship Studies. He's an active member of the activist project Watch the Med Alarm Phone, which created a hotline for migrants in distress at sea when traveling toward Europe. The Alarm Phone network consists of more than 150 human rights and freedom of movement activists located in Africa, Europe, and the US, and has been able to connect with thousands of travelers in acute emergency situations since October 2014, having a tremendous impact in directly intervening into the deadliest border zone of our world today. Our third panelist is Medhin Paolos, who's a filmmaker, photographer, musician, and activist. Her first film, Asmarina, which debuted in 2015, she co-directed with Alan Maglio, depicts the presence of the Habesha, Eritrea, and Ethiopian community in the city of Milan through the collective memories of community recorded in personal archives through photograph, music, and stories. For 10 years, Paolos was also part of the folk and electronic band Fiamma Fumana. She is the co-founder of the Milano chapter of Rete, which is a second generation network, a national organization that promotes the human and civil rights of descendants of immigrants in Italy. Currently, she is conceptualizing an educational platform for bringing forth the plurality of voices, histories, and cultures to the forefront through media and artistic interventions. And I'm really pleased to announce that she will be in residence at Harvard next year. So we'll get to enjoy her presence and her work next year. Our fourth panelist is Ms. Prerna, who is an immigration attorney for the Undocumented Student Program at the University of California, Berkeley, and is part of the East Bay Community Law Center. Lal is also a founder of Dream Activist Youth. And our last but not least panelist is our own Keish Kim, who is a graduate student, who is a graduate student in American Studies at Harvard University. She has been involved with various immigrant organizing spaces, including Freedom University, Georgia, and the Georgia Undocumented Youth Alliance. At Harvard, she's one of the co-founders of Protect Undocumented Students at Harvard, or PUSH. So if you all help me in welcoming our panelists today, please. I'll leave you all in good hands with Lisa.
Thank you so much, Lorgia, Walter, and I'm really honored to be here with this wonderful panel. I'd like to begin my remarks with 3 quotations. Rosa Escobar, whose husband Jose was deported back to Mexico, said yesterday, "My biggest fear today is getting a phone call saying that my husband has been murdered. How do I explain that to my 2 children? Why is my American dream being crushed by my own country because I'm in love with someone who is an undocumented immigrant?" The second is by Walter Benjamin, the 8th thesis on the philosophy of history, who wrote, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism." One reason why fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as a historical norm. The current amazement that things we are experiencing are still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge unless it is the knowledge that the view of history which it gives rise to is untenable. And then the third is by Maxine Hong Kingston, "In a time of destruction, create something." Being occupied, captured, forced to labor, compelled to lose one's language, to adopt the culture of the occupier, being property, being driven from one's land or being prevented from returning to one's land, hiding, fleeing, seeking refuge, surviving exile and deportation, being poor, growing poorer, forced to reproduce, prohibited from reproducing. These are all forms of undocumented knowledge and experience. They're undocumented both in the sense that such experiences are not officially admitted by the state, but also undocumented in the sense that these experiences are the precise outcomes of state violence, whose political borders designate belonging and exclusion. Or in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's famous words, the result of racism that is state-sanctioned or extra-legal production of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. To hold a symposium called Undocumented Knowledge affirms the tradition of the oppressed, which understands what Benjamin calls the state of emergency is not the exception but the rule. By this, we mean to affirm that there is knowledge beneath declarations of American exceptionalism and claims that the US is a multicultural nation founded on liberal democratic principles of inclusion and unlike European empires that colonized or subordinated others. There's a long tradition of undocumented knowledge that understands the relationship between centuries of political exclusion of the very peoples whose lives and labors were exploited to build the US nation and its empire. There is a knowledge about the specific relationship between US colonization, occupation, or intervention in Mexico, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, Cuba, Nicaragua, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Somalia, Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan, and sadly many more places. And this knowledge about the relationship between US intervention and the restricted entry and diminished chances of migrants and refugees from those very same origins. There's knowledge about the difference between freedom promised to those admitted into citizenship and the persistent conditions of barriers to freedom's flourishing. The history of US citizenship is that it has worked as a state instrument of racialized inclusion, and exclusion. From its beginnings, the US state has legislated racial belonging through the institution of citizenship. Since the 1790 US statute designating white men only as fit for citizenship, white property holding masculinity defined national citizenship for centuries. The US Constitution is replete with provisions to protect slaveholders and their rights to own property, while designating that enslaved persons would count as 3/5 of persons, though slavery is not explicitly mentioned until its abolition in the 13th Amendment. The infamous 1857 Dred Scott ruling affirmed the rights of slaveholders to take enslaved peoples into Western territories and upheld that the Constitution regarded blacks as, quote, so far inferior that they had no rights, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit, unquote. Yet even following the abolition of slavery and emancipation, even after the 14th Amendment granting citizenship and rights of men of African descent, after the 19th Amendment granting women's suffrage, and legislations granting citizenship to Native, Asian, and Mexican persons, despite birthright citizenship, whiteness and masculinity continues to be privileged qualities of normative citizenship that divide and racialize differential belonging and access to rights, wealth, mobility, safety, and life itself. While the violence of racial and gendered exclusion characterizes the historical emergence of citizenship, it's important to observe that this violence also accompanies inclusion into it. Enfranchisement and the granting of naturalization into citizenship has often meant the internalization of what Mimi T. Nguyen calls the gift of freedom, which extends conditional belonging to the grateful refugee, the indebted immigrant, the rehabilitated prisoner, in exchange for subordination to that state and empire that administers the debt that follows, even if that freedom does not include material and social supports, fair wage, housing, schooling, access to cultural expressions necessary for actual inclusion and substantive equality to occur. The gift of freedom asks that one forgets one's undocumented knowledge. Yet undocumented knowledge is so much more than what an individual can be coerced to forget. Undocumented knowledge continues even after citizenship, beyond citizenship, despite citizenship, owing to citizenship. Barriers to social equality continue. Undocumented knowledge is the understanding that racial exclusion, police brutality, military intervention, and overseas empire are not antithetical to liberal promises of freedom and equality through citizenship. They are actually parts of the same project. Liberal government secures the peaceful conditions of individual and collective security by transferring violence of the state of nature to the political state, executed through laws that protect the subjects within civil society and constitute other peoples as the very limit to that society. Undocumented knowledge tells us that liberal ideas of citizenship, emancipation, wage labor, and free trade have a long history of being the very means to ensure the liberty of some and to manage the labor, movement, reproduction, resources, and social differences of others. Undocumented knowledge continues after citizenship in our communities, our classrooms, in our art, culture, music, graffiti, in history, which all convey what Robin Kelley has called freedom dreams. By freedom dreams, Kelley evokes the Black radical imagination of Black leftists, nationalists, feminists, surrealists, women of color feminisms, certain autonomous and indigenous movements in the Americas, these are his words, who envision collectively in struggle what a revolutionary future might look like and how we might bring this new world into being. Freedom dreams are that collective force that keep oppressed peoples alive and able to dream of new and better worlds. Freedom dreams are part of a philosophy of practice that affirms both the histories of peoples in the past and in the present, struggling mightily against forces of oppression, and it emphasizes that the offered terms of liberal freedom and the social order it upholds have been inadequate for substantive freedom to be realized. W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, observed in his great work, Black Reconstruction, that slavery was not an aberration of American democracy, but its central contradiction. that abolition and political emancipation had not repaired the catastrophes of 19th century slavery, and that real emancipation could and would only occur, quote, with the emancipation of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black, unquote. Observing the persistence of enduring racial inequality after the end of South African apartheid and US civil rights in her book, The Meaning of Freedom, Angela Davis points to the enormous obstacles presented by racial liberalism and the so-called post-racialism of the 20th century. The claims that racism has ended, which mask the complex ways that racism has actually refortified within neoliberal capitalism. Davis exhorts us to imagine beyond not only liberal promises, but the prevailing political categories that limit the way we struggle against racial inequality and exclusion. All three of these visionary thinkers, Du Bois, Davis, and Kelly, are speaking undocumented knowledge. Whether we are speaking of the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples by the New England settler colonies, or the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, the enslavement of captive Africans, Jim Crow segregation, or the Flint, Michigan water crisis, whether we're speaking of manifest destiny, the war with Mexico, and the appropriation of Mexican territory that became the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and California in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, whether we were talking about the century of barring from citizenship Asian immigrants, or the Executive Order 9066 rounding up and incarcerating 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, or the waves of immigration to the United States throughout the 20th century as the US waged wars in Latin America and the Caribbean, East, Northeast, and Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. In all of this history, the racialized definitions of belonging to the US nation have been deeply connected to US empire, an empire that commands not exclusively through direct occupation, but through global capitalism and military basing. There's now, in the ostensive post-Cold War era, a vast, expansive US military basing system around the world. The anthropologist Catherine Lutz writes that the official record reports over 150,000 troops and 95,000 civilians massed in more than 800 military facilities in 45 countries and territories. Yet even these official numbers are misleading because they exclude not only the massive buildup and troop presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they also leave out the secret, the unacknowledged facilities in Israel, Kuwait, the Philippines, and many other sites. This US form of empire emphasizes war, security, surveillance, as the globalization of capitalism accelerates and rearticulates the divides between the rich and poor in the so-called developed and developing worlds. Finally, US empire is implemented not only through militarism and racial capitalism, but also through its moral instruments and juridical powers, humanitarian discourses of rescue, benevolence, and human rights, talk of just wars, preemptive invasions, the language of us and them, free and violent, liberator and liberated. These practices racialize a divided world into an international division of humanity, into those cast as inheritors of modern progress and development, and those cast as aberrant or failed peoples forever in debt who will never accede to modernity. For this reason, although our current moment of raids, detention, and terrifying executive orders appears as one of unprecedented threats to Black, Muslim, LGBTQ, Latino, Asian, and indigenous communities, to working people, people on the left, people without papers, people who are differently abled, women and girls, and immigrants and refugees from around the world. Even though it seems unprecedented, undocumented knowledge urges us not to see this moment as aberrant to liberal democratic definitions of American citizenship, but actually as an outgrowth of our past and present history. Please understand that seeing this moment in historical perspective is not to be defeatist. Invoking the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II is not to concede that the internment of Muslims will follow. It's rather to gather up our undocumented knowledge, the undocumented knowledge we have, and commit to making certain that internment cannot happen again. When we consider the period of backlashes against Reconstruction, against civil rights, against queer people, against immigrants and refugees, it's not to dwell in despair, but to unearth the histories of forward leaps, how communities and social movements resisted and struggled during slavery, in internment camps, in cross-racial solidarity, in communities led by women of color. Undocumented knowledge, refugee knowledge, queer knowledge, unofficial knowledge, workers' knowledge, subjugated knowledge, these are our enormous resources for building solidarity to respond to our present state of emergency. If we have the patience to listen to one another, to struggle together, to commit to the long, deep work of excavating, envisioning, and forging a political future that is more than the historical norm of electoral politics, we will pursue freedom dreams, and we will understand, as Antonio Gramsci, imprisoned for his undocumented thoughts, did, that, quote, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now, in this interregnum that Gramsci called a time of monsters, undocumented peoples and not the state will bring about the true state of emergence and emergency. Thank you.
Hi. I'm a little bit ill, so if I faint, that's fine. Thanks so much for having me. I have this. It's up here, but not there. Last week, Friday, we learned that 2 small boats had capsized in the central Mediterranean Sea. The bodies of only 5 people were found and retrieved, all from sub-Saharan Africa. The others went missing, and if their bodies won't wash up on Libya's shores, as so many do these days, they will remain missing. Usually 120 to 140 people cram into this type of rubber boat. So we can speculate that 240 to 280 people lost their lives. But of course, the real number will never be fully known. Just yesterday, we heard from the sole survivor of another tragedy that seems to have cost the lives of 146 people, also off the coast of Libya. Last year, we know of more than 5,000 deaths in the Mediterranean Sea. And this year, if we take this last shipwreck into account, we are already approaching 1,000 fatalities at sea, including also the 11 Syrians who drowned last week between Turkey and Greece. While these are the official figures of border deaths at sea, they are only very rough guesses. As you can imagine, the real number is presumably substantially higher because many, of course, disappear without leaving a trace and ever being accounted for. Despite this devastating situation, I think it is important to talk about political activism and resistance that practices solidarity and active flight help to contest forms of border violence that causes these mass tragedies. And in the spirit of this panel, I want to show you that creative political resistance is possible and, of course, really necessary in spaces that are commonly deemed as lying beyond the reach of non-state actors, beyond democratic scrutiny, and sometimes deemed as even lying beyond the political sphere itself, where social movements and you and me seem to have no say. While my own activism takes place in a different regional context, I wonder whether there might be insights also beneficial for different struggles here in the US, and of course also vice versa. So I'm really interested to learn more about what's going on, although I live here now. Yeah, I should say that. Given that we face a global or globalizing regime around migration and borders, solidarity activism, I think, also really needs to leave the national frame. The situation in Europe is, of course, quite different to the situation here, but at the same time, we can detect similar dynamics in the policing of human movement, both within the national frame and at what can be termed global frontiers, thus border zones that sharply or seem to sharply separate the so-called global north from the global south, such as the Mediterranean Sea between North Africa and Europe, and the Sonoran Desert between Mexico and the US. In both places, unlivable terrains have been integrated into systems of population control and migrant deterrence. Nobody desires to walk through the desert, and nobody desires to get onto these unseaworthy boats. But due to the interplay of very complex and oppressive systems of population control, they are often the few remaining escape routes. The natural elements that then endanger or even end the lives of precarious travelers provide states with a convenient alibi. Bodies disappearing without any or hardly any trace, and often in spaces with unclear or overlapping jurisdictions, rarely prompt more than short-lived public attention. So given this situation, I feel it's urgently required to find ways to enter these border zones that seem so inaccessible. And we tried to do exactly that when we launched the so-called alarm phone, which functions as a hotline for people in distress in the Mediterranean Sea. I've given out some donation flyers and also some of the cards that we distribute amongst communities where some people may consider crossing the sea. So the alarm phone receives messages and calls from people traveling through the 3 regions of the Mediterranean, between Libya and Italy, between Turkey and Greece, and Morocco and Spain. In all these regions, the situations are very different. So the organization of migration is very different in these contexts, but in one way or another, we hear about distress cases very frequently, either by the people at sea themselves or by their relatives, friends, communities, or other activists and migrant networks and informants. Just to give you a very quick and very rough idea about sea migration in the 3 different regions. First here between Morocco and Spain, you can't see the Canary Islands here, so there's a different route here. Usually people from Western Africa try to reach Spain on very small rubber boats that carry commonly fewer than 25 people. They often organized, these journeys are often organized themselves or by the migrants themselves. And they try to paddle to Spain or have small engines. They carry old mobile phones, and due to the coverage in that area, they can reach out to us. However, it is very difficult quite often to establish where they are because they cannot send their GPS positions to us. In the central Mediterranean Sea, so from Libya to Italy, which is the deadliest sea route, people from sub-Saharan Africa, but also from other places such as Syria, Palestine, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, travel on differently sized boats, right? So you have these rubber boats I mentioned before, 140 and 150 people max. You have wooden fishing vessels that can carry up to 500 people, and sometimes even many more, as it was the case on April 19, 2015, when about 900 people drowned in a single shipwreck. Boats going through the central Mediterranean tend to carry one satellite phone, which is used to make distress calls and which can easily also pass on GPS coordinates to us. But at the same time, we've also seen that smugglers have changed their tactics, so there are fewer and fewer satellite phones. So boats are just sent out without any way to get in touch with anyone else. The third sea route between Turkey and Greece has been frequented a lot. So, you know, all the pictures you've probably seen in the past few years quite often came from Greek shores. Small rubber boats with dozens of people on board, quite often from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, cross there. And since reception is given nearly throughout the Aegean Sea, people who often carry smartphones can, you know, message us. They use WhatsApp a lot. So you can see that sea journeys are differently organized in the Mediterranean. Of course, variances to these patterns I just outlined exist, so, you know, accept this as a very rough sketch. So even if you're not an expert on migration movements, you can probably imagine that carrying a mobile phone is crucial for many people on the move. Phones allow them to remain in touch with their relatives, to get in contact with contact persons along the way, and to find orientation in places of transit and arrival. And of course, at sea, phones form lifelines. So we recognize the significance of phones for unauthorized forms of migration, and we created a system through a management software that can reroute distress calls to a vast number of our volunteers, as Lorgia mentioned, 150 people at the moment, who live in 15 countries and operate the system 24/7. Since we launched the Alarm Phone in October 2014, we were involved in about 1,800 cases of boats in distress at sea. Through this phone, we have tried to intervene in real time in the Mediterranean Sea, and in some way have created a presence in a space that seemed to lie beyond the reach of social movements. For a long time, sovereign forces could act with little scrutiny. Nobody really was watching what they were up to. And under this veil of unaccountability, numerous human rights violations have occurred, either by the so-called refoulement practices, where boats and their passengers are returned to the places they had escaped from, by direct assaults on boats. So we document a lot of cases where certain units within the Greek Coast Guards actually assaulted refugee boats, took away money, phones, and sometimes stabbed their boats. Or by letting drown, so by not conducting search and rescue operations or delaying them when migrant boats were clearly in situations of distress. We also documented several cases in the central Mediterranean. So now in the past few years, a lot of humanitarian actors have also entered this space of the sea. So Doctors Without Borders are there, Sea-Watch, MOAS, and 7 or 8 others. So we have a sort of network, a non-state network in place that can monitor the actions and inactions of state forces. I think it would take way too long to try to explain or give you a sense of our experiences, but that have been both really wonderful and really awful. And I'm happy to expand on it later on, but I think for this discussion today, I want to explain briefly how we understand our activism. The Alarm Fund believes in the freedom of movement for all people. Now, in this very bordered state of the world, calling for free movement seems to be a very radical claim, and supporting people on the move or to move more freely seems to be a radical act. This claim is often ridiculed, right, as an unrealistic dream, and acts of flight help are increasingly criminalized and punished. And I don't know whether you've followed the news in the European context, a lot of these humanitarians are now being criminalized officially. However, rather than a distant utopia, we take inspiration in our work from the millionfold enactments of the freedom of movement, which we really see all around us. And what I mean by enactments of the freedom of movement is that despite or due to the ever more sophisticated forms of border control, population management, higher fences and walls, we understand them only as attempts to control and imaginaries of control, right? A lot of people still succeed to cross international borders without authorization to reach desired places. And in Europe, in the past few years, this has been really remarkable, right? In 2015 alone, more than 1 million people crossed the sea without authorization and entered EU territories. And I wonder where else in recent times have we seen migratory mass disobedience on such scale and the effective dismantling of a regime of population control to such an extent. What dominates the discourse also here in the US is a conception of these movements as a migration or refugee crisis. So it has been framed nearly exclusively in these terms of emergency and crisis, and connected then, of course, to discourses of security and even terror. But what I think is much closer to the truth is what we witnessed was a severe crisis of the European border regime. So if you can imagine that Europe's entire border architecture, right, composed of closed land borders, biometric surveillance technologies, bilateral agreements with horrible regimes, the militarization of the sea, carrier sanctions, illegal pushbacks, and of course the global visa regime, this entire architecture was unable to do what it was designed to do, which is keeping unwanted populations out while allowing desired individuals and groups rapid transborder mobility. So without glorifying or romanticizing these unauthorized movements, I think it is clear what we have witnessed over the last, or less than past 2 years, has been quite historic, and I also think it's important to recognize that. If we understand these mass transgressions as enactments of the freedom of movement, we are also prompted to think more closely about the complex interconnections between movement thought as motion and movement thought as political struggle. Commonly, migrant movements are not understood as political per se, right? Either they are completely forced due to war and conflict, thus leaving hardly or no agency to the people called refugees, or they are or they move totally voluntarily by simply following sort of economic rationales, which turns them into these weird, economic migrants, whoever they are, who do not need or deserve protection in the place of arrival. This simplistic binary does justice neither to the complexity of migration and flight, nor to the subjectivity and subjective dimension of migration. So in this context of mass suffering at global frontier zones, which is of course directly related to the erosion of both the right to stay and the right to move, we have to allow ourselves to conceive of unauthorized forms of traveling as contestations of present conditions of mobility control that mirror and are part and parcel of forms of global injustice. Acknowledging these struggles as transformative political processes, I think, is a first step. But then it is also really required to enact solidarity with these embodied rebellions against what some have called, global apartheid-like regimes of population control. And what they bring with them are very dystopian, for me at least, very dystopian realizations of a very hyper-mobile world for the privileged few and the accelerated borderization of the planet for the exploitable many. Thinking about unauthorized migration as risky enactments of free movement can repoliticize migration and also prompt an activism that is formulated around solidarity and not around savior-victim dynamics. For us at the Alarm Front, I think it is crucial to point to migration and escape as political acts. And we understand ourselves not as humanitarians, but as solidarity activists who are part of a long trajectory and history of struggle around the freedom of movement. Many in our network have, in fact, drawn inspiration from past episodes of militant activism here in the US, namely the Underground Railroad, right? Which was a clandestine network of secret routes and safe houses that allowed enslaved African Americans to escape to free states. The enactments of political resistance through acts of escape were supported by a range of people in solidarity who offered flight help and sanctuary along the way. Today, there are various underground railroads to Europe, at least, and elsewhere as well. And those who facilitate irregularized movements are most often part of migrant communities themselves. So I think these are some of the undocumented or unacknowledged and subjugated knowledges that Lisa talked about. Especially also in 2015 and 2016, the Alarm Front worked closely with Syrian and Iraqi activists, some of whom had survived the sea crossing themselves, and then tried to assist those en route. Without being tapped into local migratory knowledges and to have gained trust, the Alarm Front would just not be able to work. It is also important to stress that several of our members have survived the European borders themselves and who crossed from different places and at different times. For me, in this sense, the Alarm Front tries to bridge, or rather collapse, the often maintained, but I think erroneous dualism between movements considered social or activist and those considered migratory, where the politicality of the former is routinely presumed, while the latter is doubted or ignored. And I wondered, to just return to the context here and as a way of concluding, whether the knowledges, the practices, the networks, the solidarities of struggle that were created and fostered in Europe over the last years could be and even need to be brought to our present situation here. While I do not really have the time and also not frankly, the expertise to comment on that in any detail, I think it is fascinating to think about how the 19th century US Underground Railroad provides vocabulary and inspiration for 21st century solidarity movements in the European context and for practices of flight help. And I now wonder whether these experiences and fugitive or undocumented knowledges need to be translated back into present-day USA with all the oppressions that we are currently facing. Thank you.
Provo. Hi, I'm Medhin. I'm from Italy. I would like to speak about the issue of citizenship and what it means to have to create your own safe space, your own home, in a place that is supposed to be already your home. I'm a daughter of immigrants, Eritrean immigrants, and I was born and raised in Milan, Italy, north of Italy. I was raised with a very strong sense of being observed all the time, because I was growing up mainly in the 80s and 90s, and I felt constantly the eyes of everybody, not necessarily in a negative way, but in a very curious way, on me all the time. So much so that the first few times that I went in a school trip in London or in Paris, yeah, fancy. One of the most beautiful thing for me was to walk around those towns by myself, because I felt for the first time like nobody was looking at me. I went to my country of origin, Eritrea, for the second time, but I consider that to be the first time when I was 11, because that's when Eritrea got its independence from Ethiopia. I had great expectations. I had the sense that, oh, I'm gonna go home and everybody's going to look like me, and that is going to be the top of the top. Of course, you can probably imagine I got there, and again, those eyes on me. Because again, I looked like a foreigner. Not my features, but the way I move myself, the way maybe I dress. It's I move my hands like a typical Italian. My Tigrinya is very broken. The main Eritrean language is very broken. I spoke it maybe a bit better back then, and now I'm losing it. And actually now I'm getting it back because of the refugees coming through Italy, because I also work as a volunteer with them. I'm getting my language of origin back. And so I had, growing up, a sense of not belonging. Speaking with other kids of immigrants, regardless of their origins, there's always a bit that risk, especially in the 90s or early 2000s. Now it's a bit different. In a few years, the situation is changing so much, so quickly, remaining outside of this group and that group, this community and also that community. So there is a sort of a saying in Italian, vivere la terra di mezzo. La terra di mezzo means the land in between. And I have a sense that this imaginary land in between is not only a safe space, because we're talking also about sanctuaries and creating safe spaces, for me, but for so many, so crowded. It's not even original anymore to be, a person that has a plural identity. But Italy is a very particular place. Maybe it's known because its people are, fun and welcoming, and they are welcoming. But it's also a country that has a very dark past of colonialism, and again, I am originally from Eritrea. Eritrea used to be an Italian colony alongside Somalia and Libya. And that's a whole part of history that's so hidden, but it's still in the culture so much, so much, in the most subtle ways. And one of the ways is the law on citizenship. I found out that I wasn't an Italian citizen early on. And that's one thing that made me feel stranger in my own home. While you're a minor, that's maybe not a big deal, but when you grow up and you have to go in the work field, so many opportunities are cut off, are not open to you just because of that piece of paper. I personally think that the freedom of mobility is probably one of the biggest issues of our times. You were speaking before, these people are, have it even harder. They have to go from their home to another country, and then, wherever they want to be resettled in Europe, escaping, like they're thieves, like they're criminals, and they're not. They're just trying to, get to a safer place. So I am now a member of an organization, national organization that is called G2 Network. And this network is formed by all kids of immigrants. Well, we're not kids, we're adults, but all sons and daughters of immigrants. Sorry, my English is not great, but I'm trying. All sons and daughters of immigrants, and our main objective is the reform on citizenship law. Why? Because the Italian law on citizenship is very old. It was taught in a time where Italy was a country of immigrants. I don't know, maybe some of you have an Italian last name in the crowd. So that law was meant for you, for people like you, to retain your citizenship. So you wouldn't lose it, even if you were born abroad. But the law didn't think, it's a bit old, didn't think about the kids that were born after, like me. So all we're asking is not to change completely the law, it's just to make it a little more inclusive. So why the name G2 Network? Because the second generation is not a term that we invented. But and also we didn't like what it meant at the time, but so we redefined it, and we started using it. At the time, the organization was born in 2005. The law is yet not changed. At the time, the main issue was to let people know that we exist, because up until then, we would hear a lot talk about migration, immigrants, but not so much about Italians of other origins. So what it means to go around Rome, Florence, or wherever in Italy with this face and with an Italian accent, regional common accent, and not having the same question, where you're from, where you're really from, or how, or being complimented a gazillion times a day on your perfect, beautiful Italian. It's not offensive, but it's a bit of a waste of time, And no, also it puts you in question. Why are you here? Even if you're telling me that with a smile, you're still questioning me. Just a couple of days ago, when I went through security at the airport in Boston. And that had not happened to me in a long, long time. I've been really lucky. The policewoman, the first thing she tells me is, how did you get this Italian passport? What do you mean, how you get it? It's born and raised in Italy. But the thing is, actually, I answered that to her, but actually the answer was not correct, because the Italian law says that we don't have the ius sanguinis like you have here. We have a ius soli. So you inherit the citizenship of your parent. So if you are a kid from, you need to have at least one Italian parent. I had none. So what you can do is to wait until you're 18, and when you turn 18, you have a window of 1 year to ask for your citizenship, and then they can make you a concession. But first, you need to know that you have that possibility. So one of the things that we were able to do is that now all 18-year-old in Italy, or in the whole country, they get a letter directly to home, and with the whole list of the procedure, and they can at least ask. It's not a guarantee that they will get it, I know people personally that did not have the Italian citizenship, and at the time they got the letter to go into the military when it was you had to do it, you know. And so it was weird because the law is so absurd that even they make this mistake. You know, it's so strange. What do we do? For the most part, we lobby. None of us, well, some of us are lawyers, some of us are journalists, some of us are like artists. We have all different, we come from all different type of backgrounds, where some are teachers, and the younger ones are just students. Sorry, just students, I didn't mean like that. We put on the table whatever it is that we can do. I actually initially was years and years ago. I was looking for. I liked the idea because I liked the attitude that I saw in the people that were starting this organization. I got to it a little later. I liked the attitude of not complaining, of understanding what the issue was, and actually trying to self-educate themselves on the actual law and decide what to do. And now it's been 10 years, so I mean, the law, it's not changed yet, but it's about to. They're dragging it out a little bit. We lobby, that's the main job, but we also work with schools. And in the beginning, we worked a lot with students, and then we understood that we needed to talk to the teachers as well, because sometimes they meant well, but they didn't have the tools to speak about certain issues. In Italy, it's very, very complicated because there's this politically correctness going on. Like, for example, every single movie that you will see where they say black here, they will translate it as a of color, like a person of color. In Italy, when you say of color, it's not a generic, it means black. They do not want to say black. It's not polite for them. Or even the word razza, race. How can you talk about race? You can't even say the word. It's so insane, so strange. So it's very, very, very tiring to try to not educate people, because that's not our job, but to just make it easier, make it simple, you know, and make it more inclusive. But I wanted to. I did not plan to say this, but I found so interesting what you were talking about, your work, and I wanted to say this. Once you actually you get your identity together, you know, you get in balance, you know, because it's a constant little bit of a struggle to understand where you belong. You know, in 2013, in Milan, in the quartiere Porta Venezia, we saw like a flood of people coming in town, from especially from Syria, Palestine, and Eritrea. People did not know what to do. They kept calling an emergency, an emergency, an emergency. Municipality reacted in a very shady way, meaning that they were welcoming Syrian refugees, but they were closing their eyes in front of everybody else. And so we had literally tons of people, so many people in the streets. And who reacted? Citizens. Especially Eritreans and Ethiopians, people who migrated years ago, and kids of immigrants. They got together, even people that didn't know each other, and they formed de facto an organization in the streets, because they were not welcome anywhere at the time. And now there are places, dorms, and everything. You know, and now it's structured. It's not, I don't see a project in the long run, because there's no will from the municipality or the government, Italian government, to actually solve the situations. But the volunteers and Italian citizens got into the, you know, the volunteering as well. They did all. We were literally in the street, and we called the medics, like the ambulances. There was food. There was everything, and especially informations. And you know, people arriving where they would find they all went to Porta Venezia, this particular part of town, because that is known like a quartiere africano. You know, especially if you're an Eritrean or in Ethiopia, you know you will find someone that speaks your language. You know, you will there where you will find the next step, the next link to go to Switzerland, to Germany, to wherever you need to go, and that's that. You know, and networking. Now that is I see this group getting more and more and more organized and getting in a network with other groups around Italy. And I would love for that to become bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, because I see this grassroots little organization being born, you know, everywhere with so much will of do well, but they all of them, they start from scratch each time. But to share the knowledge, to share the practice, it would be much, much easier. Sorry, I meant to talk about something else, but I do that sometimes. Okay. Yeah. I meant to talk about completely different thing, but it's okay. Oh, sorry.
I always have to worry about whether I'll like fit the podium, you know. But it seems to be working out, I guess. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. Hello, I'm Prerna. I come from Berkeley, California, the bubble. I have not melted yet, thanks to the lack of snow, and the sunshine has been great today, so that's nice. I come at this sort of topic and place as an accident, really, and an accident of being brought here at this age, at the age of 15, and having to deal with, you know, America and American high schools and being horrified, really. You know, my parents are from Fiji, and it's funny because whenever I present a Fijian passport to a CBP agent, they look at me and they get really excited and they want to talk about where I'm from and talk about the beautiful islands and want to have a conversation with me, really, when I'm just trying to board a plane. So it's an interesting experience because, you know, migration in this country has really been atrocious for most people. And even my own experience has been pretty atrocious. So when I was about 18, I found out that I was undocumented. I had sort of no idea up until that point that I didn't have any paperwork whatsoever. What had happened, making a very long story short, is, you know, my grandmother, who's a U.S. citizen, had sponsored my parents, but by the time that paperwork was going to be processed, it would take ages because we live in a very archaic immigration system. So by the time my parents could get their papers, I was over the age of 21, which is the age of a child in immigration law, under 21. And I'd aged out of the process, basically. So, you know, they tell us to get in line, right? So I got in line. I applied to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for my papers. And I was told, sorry, no, you're not a child anymore. It doesn't matter if you think you waited in line for, what is it, a decade. They put me in proceedings to be deported. The great thing about, you know, the U.S. immigration system being so archaic is it's so slow as a process that I'm still here. No. Well, what really happened was we pushed back, right? We organized. When I was around 22, there was this really bad immigration bill. It's the Asmarina bill. I don't know how many of you sort of remember this. I'm so old, I feel like, but not really. About 12 years ago, that made being undocumented in the U.S. a felony crime. And people sort of woke up a sleeping giant in the sense that people started protesting and organizing, mostly through Spanish language radio, but also just word of mouth as well, and coming out to the streets and sort of killed the bill and propelled, you know, some sort of lukewarm immigration reform to be discussed, part of which was this very conservative idea called the DREAM Act, which is basically like a little small legislation that would have given people who are brought here as children a pathway to citizenship if they behave themselves, which is sort of the opposite of what many of us have done. But so what had happened was this bill also died in 2007 along with immigration reform, which has been sort of dying since then slowly. What happened then was I was 22, I didn't have any papers, and I found sort of a network of people online through different places telling their stories and seeking to sort of form community. And because we had a shared experience of sort of growing up in a country where we didn't really belong, but also did and didn't really know what to do. And there are also barriers when you're undocumented, right? I'm sure, as everyone probably knows, like the ability to not go to sort of have higher education, to not have a driver's license sometimes, to not be able to afford school, healthcare, lack of healthcare, and not be able to work, most of all, to support yourself or your family, basically being part of an underground economy. And that's what I was. I was part of the underground economy. My mom had a cleaning business, and that's what we did. We would just clean different offices every night. And that's how we sort of got by, and that's how I sort of got through college at the time. I was lucky that I grew up in California, where we had legislation that would allow people like me to have institution. So that would help with sort of educational equity. But people who were undocumented, like young people, got together online and decided to form a network of not just sort of sharing their stories, but also like lobbying legislators, whether they were city council officials or state legislators or federal politicians, to either pass the DREAM Act or to do something, some sort of immigration reform to give people a fighting chance, like basically some sort of equity to get them to the starting line that, yes, you can use your degree, or yes, you can go to college, or do anything you really want to do. But what had happened was, we started off with simple things like writing letters to congresspersons and getting a form template back in response, sometimes not even getting a response. And a lot of people also organized during Obama's sort of election, which was seen as unprecedented and historic, and in many ways it was. But he sort of wasted his political capital that he had on healthcare. And people got even more and more impatient over time. At the same time, we had all these deportations that were happening daily of thousands of people who were undocumented, people like myself who had grown up here and went to schools here, who were also out of status and were being deported. So we started having like stop deportation campaigns weekly, where we would target DHS's Department of Homeland Security here with emails and messages telling them to stop someone's deportation. And it was really a trial and error tactic at the time, basically deciding what worked and what didn't. At one point, we were told by DHS to stop spamming them because it wasn't going to work. I think Janet Napolitano, who's now at the UC system, changed her email because of me, and never found out her new one. Now I know her new one. But it so happened that it started working, that telling compelling stories of mothers and fathers and parents and siblings who are here, who have worked here all their life, lived here all their life, telling stories of family separation and horror of migration and deportation, worked and bought people some time. They bought them stays of deportations as well. But that's all it was winning us. It wasn't winning us anything else. And it seemed like a big deal at the time, though, to win these struggles one after another. But it wasn't until undocumented immigrants started organizing civil disobedience actions, basically borrowing a page from the civil rights movements of the 60s, getting arrested in political offices like John McCain's office in Arizona, asking him to just do one thing, right, co-sponsor the DREAM Act. It's a very, very small thing to do. That there was sort of a moral crisis because being undocumented, coming out, being arrested would mean certain deportation. And I'll just be honest, people looked really cute in caps and gowns, right? And speaking quote-unquote perfect English. They looked like model immigrants, and yet they were subject to deportation and the threat of deportation at the time. And I remember being parts of actions where we shut down traffic in Wilshire Boulevard. Some of my friends chained themselves to buildings. There was one action where I think 21 undocumented youth took over Capitol buildings. and were arrested, funnily enough, and banned from those buildings as well for a whole year. But somehow those records are now, you can't find them anymore. They just sort of disappeared over time from public record. So anyway, all this created a moral crisis for the Obama administration because it's supposed to be on our side, obviously, right, left of center. But still was deporting, I think, a record 2.5 million people, if I'm not mistaken. So it was finally pressure from the inside as well as pressure from activists that led to the creation of the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, in 2012, whereby Obama took the podium, waved a wand, saying basically, hey, if you have been here since the age of 15 and however many months, or below 16, and have attended high school or have a GED, equivalent of a high school education, and have no major criminal history, you can basically get a 2-year work permit that you can renew. And it seemed like a really, really small victory because it's a 2-year work permit. What does it get you, really? But it really made a difference to 800,000 people all over across the country who were able to get a work permit for the first time, Social Security number, a state ID card, a license, be able to travel abroad using advanced parole to study in different countries, visit relatives they haven't seen in a long time, even for employment opportunities. So it's been path-breaking in a way, and we wish for so much more because we sort of now live in a very different political climate, a political climate where while we still have DACA, thankfully, we also have mass deportations and detention, and the threat of the Muslim ban, as everyone's been probably following in the news. So many other things where immigrants are so much, still scapegoated. So I guess the fight continues. I want to talk very briefly about my role now at the UC Berkeley Undocumented Student Program. I teach at the law school, so I train public interest lawyers in how to basically be public interest lawyers, or good ones. But I also sort of handle the cases of the undocumented students at UC Berkeley. And the program started in 2012 with just a half-time coordinator who was told, oh, you can be half-time because there's only about 40 students here who you'll serve. And he slowly found out that was not the case. And in his first year, I encountered about 200 people who came to his office looking for help. And he very, very quickly went from a half-time position to a full-time position, and also realized that, one, our students needed mental health, so he finally was able to get a full-time psychologist on staff. And two, he needed like an actual lawyer on staff to deal with people's immigration problems, because if you could deal with somebody's immigration issues, then their mental health issues would probably get better too, right? So then I was hired in 2015 to basically serve as an attorney for the program, and we've seen about 500 undocumented students so far. We also serve their parents as well. So that's been exciting to be able to use this sort of university resources to be able to serve communities of color and communities that come from really low-income backgrounds who cannot ever afford a lawyer or see a lawyer. And thus far, we've given out about $100,000 in application fees for students, which has been great. And we also do things like emergency loans and library lending programs. And since I work at the East Bay Community Law Center, we also do a lot of expungements for criminal convictions. And because our students also get profiled or had drinking and driving problems as well. So there's a slew of problems that happen on a college campus that leads to these issues. So, and I just recently hired a full-time program coordinator and paralegal, so just to support the program, because one person can't actually serve 500 people, I've realized quickly enough. So this is part of educational equity for us, because it's to get everyone at the starting level, because our students shouldn't be worrying about their immigration status. They should be worrying about school at that stage in their life. So I'm sort of hoping to create this program and sustain it long-term as a 5-year plan, so we'll see where that goes. But so far, so good. And we can talk more about that and all the other work I've been doing.
Hi, I'm Keish. This wasn't the introduction or the start of the thing that, that I was planning. But one thing to note is that, interesting situation. I will have my phone with me, and I am in a situation where I have to check my phone constantly, and if I get an emergency call from my parents, I am gonna have to like step down, even if it's like mid conversation, to take the call. Just to let y'all know, which is interesting, timely situation. But okay, so, and I wasn't gonna tell you a bit of my story until Prerna sort of shared theirs, because it's related, it's funny. So my name is Keish Kim, and I'm coming from Georgia, but my family and I immigrated to the US when I was 8 years old from South Korea. And in 2009, I graduated high school, and that's sort of when I really realized when I was undocumented. So let me just stop here for a second and then tell you something. I stopped telling folks and community members, in different spaces, I stopped telling my story because oftentimes the way that these stories are consumed, it's out of pity or it's out of a particular kind of a consumption, and I stopped telling them. But the reason why I am doing so today is because Prerna's here. So in 2009, I graduated high school, and Georgia had just implemented its policy 416, which prohibits undocumented students, regardless of financial abundancy, affluency, bans undocumented students from even applying to the admission of the public 5 universities in Georgia, let alone that we have to pay out-of-state tuition as international students, being considered international students. So I graduated high school and came to this position where I really didn't know what to do, where to go, where to work, and I was at this really space of like standstill, of impasse. And what I ended up doing was I read a newspaper article on Prerna on New York Times, and actually like found her name and emailed her like, "Hi Prerna, like my name is Keish, I need help." I don't know if you remember that, but you had, listen, I emailed her out of the blue, and she had connected me to an organizer in Georgia that got me into organizing with the Georgia Undocumented Youth Alliance, which had been center group who have like staged some of the civil disobedience that Prerna had mentioned, which also led me to Freedom University. And it only took me coming to Harvard to be on this panel to actually meet Prerna in person. It's interesting. But what I wanted to share with you all is sort of connecting communication, connecting freedom of movement, connecting the activism nationally, transnationally, and locally. So I'm bringing in the local conversation here with you all. So I wanted to sort of share with you what has been happening on campus, around Sanctuary Campus, and student organizing at Harvard. Harvard has been one of the first college campus to organize around the Sanctuary Campus call, and this isn't really to like fight for like who was first and we're the best or anything like that. But to recognize that Harvard's mobilization around Sanctuary Campus come from a particular kind of space. The student mobilizing around recognizing the ever more precarious location of undocumented peers was immediate to the election results. There had been a group of students in a class that Lorgia had taught who had been talking about the locations of citizenship, of race, of class for a while, for a whole semester. There have been conversations regarding the navigation of these social political locations. There had been the Monday prior to the Tuesday election, a very beautiful, powerful, and emotional campus performance, which entailed the burning of John Harvard's statue with tacos, with signs that marked the statue figure with a sign that says he's a bad hombre, There's a sign that said that Harvard as ataquería Harvard, and there was a performance of breaking piñatas on campus, of symbolic funerals, of spoken word pieces addressing the context of bigotry, hatred, and violence against so many and too many of us. The class and the group of students met on the following Wednesday after the election results. And we had identified, we were very emotional. We were trying to identify the needs. We were in a position where we were able to identify the need and sort of articulate the next steps of how should we address the election results. That led to the drafting a list of resources and supports that is missing at Harvard. And these conversations came out of that space in that particular location. There was a recognition of injustice and violence, of tangible fear and division across struggles. There was pain, there was fear, of anger, and love. In the petition, which had garnered close to 6,000 signatures across colleges at Harvard, we have identified the need for the following. We had asked for the opening of a physical office to house and distribute financial, legal, professional, and mental health resources for undocumented members of the Harvard community, and the hiring of staff people to specifically for that office for the purpose of the running of the office. This meant the commitment to a physical space meant the establishment and the reaffirmation of the ongoing investment in the well-being of low-income immigrant community members at Harvard. It also, in the establishment of such a physical office would mean that there would be an expansion of the existing fund and an establishment of a distinct budget to cover related legal proceedings that students and community members may face, and to make these resources known and available, like very public throughout campus, sort of what Prerna's office at UC Berkeley has already have established and been expanding. It also requires, and we had asked in our petition, to hire a legal team of professionals who have expertise working with and supporting undocumented individuals, and the hiring of mental health professionals who have cultural competency in working with politically marginalized community and trauma-related issues of family separation and chronic threats of deportation. And here we also added the need for the increased percentage of tenured faculties of color, specifically those teaching courses related to ethnicity, indigeneity, migration, gender, and et cetera. And the development of an approach to finding and using resources that expand the understanding of problems which are related to undocumented immigration. And I've been thinking about this aspect of institutional support and commitment as a person who is pursuing a PhD here, who is working in the academia, who have decided to be in the academia, with questions around migration, citizenship, and social formations, and as a person who is undocumented. What does it mean for an institution to be invested in the kind of question that I'm asking, and be invested in my well-being as a scholar and as a person, and as an intellectual laborer, and the communities, and to be studying and working with the communities that I belong in, the kind of communities that my research would be belonging in, and where the knowledges are being amplified from. So what does it mean for Harvard to have and host and invite all these wonderful speakers and host it at Harvard campus, right? And have this dialogue to have an audience who are listening and taking in these kind of knowledges, and what does it mean for Harvard to not support the needs of undocumented students in recognizing and responding to the call for a sanctuary campus and the physical space. In our efforts of organizing, we have seen that the university often seeks to divide the conversation between undergraduates and graduate students, which have been kind of frustrating on my part and my colleagues. So we've been asking that question for a little bit, like, why is it that they're trying to divide us? That why or how should we address this effectively? Because in our efforts, rhetorically and materially, we have been working together across disciplines, across colleges, as students who see these needs as very desperate and dire and immediate. It is a group of both undergraduate and graduate students drafting, editing, speaking, writing to the university as a whole. Some of the other hurdles that we have seen had been a lot of the rhetoric and the conversation had been funneled through a very small group of students, and that it's not really addressed to us as a whole, right? And when we do address the needs of undocumented communities, as Harvard has been doing, just towards students, who are we putting outside? So what about the staffs, the faculty members who may have undocumented family members or even laborers? Like, how do we know who is employed and who is employed to like different contracted laboring companies and things like that? Some of these aspects are always, in a way, pushed into the shadows that we cannot really talk about them. When we talk about the needs and our needs being met, it always has to be in justification for, I am a student, I have something to provide you, I have the intellectual, right? It's always a justification. I'm a student, so I must have access to these safety nets. But what about my parents? Like, what about those who don't have that location to justify the access, justify their need to these access to resources? Some of these questions we still haven't answered, and it's always like institutional difficulty, right? There's different reasons why we can't ask these questions always in public out loud and be angry at them. And the response from Harvard that we have gotten, the response that we have received from Harvard University, and particularly President Jufoss, has been the reiteration of the policy of the University Police Department not to inquire about the immigration status of students, faculty, or staff, and highlighted that the University Police Department is not involved in enforcing federal immigration laws. President Foss also stated that the university will, quote, will not voluntarily share information on the immigration status of undocumented members of our community, end quote, and that, quote, law enforcement officials seeking to enter campus are expected to check in first with the Harvard University Police Department, and in case of involving enforcement of immigration laws, will be required to obtain a warrant, end quote. But this doesn't really address the needs that we have established and asked for. We have stated that the declaring Harvard as a sanctuary campus is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a necessary step in reaffirming the university's commitment to the well-being of undocumented students and students of mixed status families. And again, returning to the petition that we have drafted, the needs and the demands under what a sanctuary campus is for us requires commitment to a real, tangible, and serious needs of some of the most vulnerable members of Harvard's community. And it's interesting that Medhin has said it's not our role to educate all the time, but it is really trying to understand Harvard's campus at large, right? It is the spreading of knowledge on the actual material impacts of these anti-immigration policies, especially with all these recognized detainment and use of force against immigrant communities in the past few weeks. Like, it takes these knowledges and reiteration and us sharing these stories to inform the larger community how much the material and physical impact that some of us and many of us in different locations are facing, right? In the past weeks, I have seen countless of petitions of coverages on DACA recipients who have been detained without warrants, detained through forged and falsified evidence, of agent ICE, so immigration custom enforcement officers, now shooting people. This happened recently in Chicago a few days ago. And recognizing that these are reported and recognized stories by community members that's being able to be carried outside of those spaces, right? And I'm again recognizing that I'm obtaining these stories of unfair detention, unfair use of force, and unjust use of force through news medias and petitions, which means that it's coming from a location where there has been a community involvement and a network, a relationship that has been established where witnessing and experiencing such violences can be projected and amplified into the public space. So then we need to ask the next step questions of, what about communities where such relationships have not been established, right? I'm recognizing not just Asian communities where such networks are flimsy and very spread out throughout the US, but I'm also recognizing like undocumented Black communities and undocumented like Muslim communities. As a student who is directly affected and going on social media, engaging with news outlets every day, I'm being informed with all the ways that this administration is targeting our communities left and right, Chicago, Seattle, all throughout California. There are pictures and videos of police checkpoints near where my parents live every week. All this to say, sometimes it is hard for a campus like Harvard to understand the lived violences such as this. It is a particular kind of violences one cannot just show someone else. It is not, and put this on parentheses, always a physical scar, because some do have physical scars from police brutality and immigration custom officers to show. But it is not always a physical scar or wound that we can open up and show others. So how can we get the students to consider strikes or walkouts and teach-ins so that it's not just few of us who are directly impacted, trying to do everything on our own? How can faculty support these efforts further and better and more effectively? Where does local immigrant rights organizations fit into this organizing space where we are in this private institution that is privileged? And there have been many forms and drafted petitions by various student groups and coalitions across campus responding to the multiplicity of attacks this administration has been targeting. So some of my more lingering questions are, how do we sustain and expand coalition building on and throughout campus, as well as where the communities outside of this in this institution, in our formulations and articulations for change? So I'm just gonna leave you with some questions. Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Yes, and I wanted to say that we're videotaping this for posting on the Warren Center website, but the videotaping is only happening towards today's stage, so I hope people will feel free to know that their questions can be stated without their face being recorded.
So I need to stand. So while people get the courage to get it moving, I was wondering if Prerna, you could tell us a little bit more about the history, if you know, of so as Keish explained, we're also struggling at Harvard to replicate, if you will, the kind of work that it's being done at Berkeley, and I'm wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on the kinds of the history, if you will, of student activism, which I presume was linked to that, and how.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, none of this would be possible without any, student activism. I think it was the students who really demanded that the chancellor at Berkeley at the time in 2012 would sort of set aside money for the program. What really helped a lot was, one, DACA Festival, because it provided momentum and provided students the opportunity to come out and talk about their stories and feel a little bit safer on campus. Sorry?
Yeah, I just used a festival. Is this DACA Festival?
No, sorry, first, I said festival.
Oh, first of all, sorry.
Sorry, it's okay. We haven't had a festival yet, no. But
That sounds great, though.
it does sound like a
Let's
fun
have a
idea.
DACA festival.
I'll think about this.
Love it.
It's like my clinics. But the other thing that was really helpful was that Janet Napolitano, who had deported 2 million people as DHS secretary, got appointed UC chancellor. And the students were just riled up, and we had surveys at the university about what percentage of your family who do you know who's been deported, and at least half our students had a family member who had been deported, whether by this administration or the last one or the previous one. But we had fathers and mothers who had been deported, we had siblings who had been deported, so there was a lot of cause and concern, and they really protested her every single time she spoke, and she couldn't just take it anymore. Pretty much. And so she gave, I think 5 million or so in grants to sort of have the students establish, a festival, a legal support program, and a director of undocumented student programs at every UC. And that also then inspired more conversations about getting outside funding besides Janet's money, sort of, to fund the program at Berkeley on its own. So none of this, I wouldn't be here without student activism, whether it's my own or anybody else's. That's very important to note, definitely. And the students keep organizing. Right now, while we have a Dream Resource Center on campus, I still don't have an office on campus. So that's their big ask, and that's because they want to be able to bug me every hour of the day. So their big ask right now is for me to also have an office on campus as opposed to having the Community Law Center, which is like a mile away from campus. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you. So we need to hire Janet Napolitano at Harvard. Who does? Just checking.
Or somebody controversial, I guess.
Well. Questions from the audience? Yeah, Ruben.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruben. I'm a sophomore at the college. And as Professor Garcia Peña mentioned at the beginning, we don't have any semblance of an ethnic studies program. And we quite honestly don't have the infrastructure now. And I was wondering if any of the panelists had any idea of kind of where we go, given that Harvard is like 30 plus years behind in, ethnic studies, their offerings, and the fact that the field has changed so much. So I guess my first part question is, how do we advocate for a program? And then what can we do as individuals in the classroom to, do that academic work without the infrastructure in place?
Lisa, would you mind? Thank you, Ruben. Is it working?
Yeah, thanks. I think these are really difficult questions. I came from UC San Diego, where we also, as one of the UCs, unlike Berkeley, that was mostly science research, didn't have an ethnic studies program 20 years ago. So unlike the ones that were established in the 1970s. And it actually gave us this opportunity to study race in a comparative and international way that many of the earlier ethnic studies programs were unable to do. So we had a kind of latecomers advantage. And so you could think about it that way once you are able to establish something. When I came here to Tufts 4 years ago, they hadn't had an Africana studies program. So there was student activism, and an Africana studies program was established, as well as a minor in Asian American studies. And so along with student activism, faculty got together and established something that we're calling the Consortium of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. And it includes this program in Africana Studies, the program in American Studies, which is the largest one. For Tufts, it's large. It's 70, 80 majors. And Asian American Studies, Latino Studies, and we have a program in Colonialism Studies to ensure that we study race and inequality in relation to colonialism and empire. And I think the idea of the consortium was also, in a way, to take advantage of being late, even though it's horrible to be late, to reconceive some of these issues not as single group histories, but as always interconnected, not equivalent, but often very asymmetrical, but linked and connected in various ways. And so the consortium model, it could be a department, but it could have these different elements within it, was helpful for our site. So I don't know what would work here, but it seems like you have really, sympathetic faculty, and you could press for something that isn't a repetition of something that answered to the 1970s, but is something that answers to the 20 teens.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is there a relationship, or what could the relationship be between, I think 3 things I guess have been talking about like bureaucratic, or not bureaucratic, administrative like protections to for undocumented students within campuses, and advancing and learning from undocumented knowledge in the classroom, and like advocacy and work with and for like migrants globally and sort of outside of necessarily the university context.
Maurice, would you mind taking that one?
So I can just talk from my own experience, maybe. So I'm at UC Davis, and it has a lot of great radical faculty. It has African American and African studies. It has various kind of radical causes, and a lot of faculty connect their work with activism, which I think is really great. But this said, you know, there's already a space established where I then came in, and I was allowed to teach whatever I wanted to teach, which was stuff on activism around migration and the border. So I've been really lucky to be able to do that, and I had students from African American, African studies, from Asian studies, from cultural studies, so various different student populations. And I think the feedback I got was that they were also looking for a space where they could talk and engage on these issues. And actually, the class I taught for African American African studies happened the day after the election, and some of the students came to me and they said, well, it's the first class where we can actually talk about it, because in the other classes, which was not in African American studies, there was no space for it, right? And some of the faculty hadn't even acknowledged the election the night before, which I found just stunning. So I think for faculty to offer some space, but then also for students to take it, right? To demand it. If nobody recognizes it in class, ask for the space to be discussed. But I'm not from the US, and I don't know the US academia that well, to be very honest. So I'm not an authority on it.
I'm not, but I might just add, I mean, you're here in Cambridge, but there's also Boston very nearby, there's Roxbury, there's Dorchester, there are lots of different kinds of communities to work with in ways that would, I think, connect with what you're learning in the classroom as well. That was what your question was?
Sorry, just to add to that, exactly, because you said that. We have some faculty who closely work with local communities, right? In Knights Landing, for example, which is close to UC Davis, a lot of laborers live there in really precarious conditions. So some of the faculty members, they created classes where they, generated exchange between students who went to Knights Landing and tried to establish some structures and some exchange there. So I think this is a really productive model, right? So like look around, there are a lot of precarious communities who can benefit from the resources that universities have, and vice versa, right? Students can learn a lot from engaging with these communities. So yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for speaking. My name is Daishi. I'm a sophomore at the college. And I'm a part of Act on a Dream, which is the student organization for undocumented DACA and mixed status family students and allies. And also just for anyone in the room who who wants to find a community, we're here, and that, or any resources, that we're here and that we love you. This is really a question to Prerna. So as someone with that experience of working with reaching out to students and receiving or giving the help, actually, how do you reach students who haven't really made their legal status their salient part of their identity, and how do you reach students regardless of whatever the spectrum of being undocumented, so everyone can get the help that as it currently stands at Harvard?
Yeah, that's a great question. Visibility, I think, is very important. I think spreading the word, whether it's by working with faculty, whether it's by accepting more invitations to speak at Berkeley than anywhere else, whether it's basically like having the undocumented student program also be grounded in the educational opportunity program, so it's reaching out to all low-income college students, sort of regardless of status. That's been important because people, when they walk through the doors to sort of go to the undocumented student program, don't have to feel like they're stigmatized in terms of seeking services there, because that whole program exists for all students of color who mostly come from low-income families. So that's been a sort of a tactical thing that we have done, being rooted in the Center for Equity and Inclusion, which is also part of the Educational Opportunity Program. The other thing is just being visible online on our websites, social media. A lot of students like to communicate, from my own personal experience, through email or Twitter or Facebook, and being open to receiving that. And basically being able to have a tool where students can make appointments online as well without talking to anybody has been really beneficial. And I mean, it's not perfect, right? I still see that, like, we have, say, 40% undocumented students who are Asian American, but I only see about 25% of them. So I see the difference. And there's so much more that needs to be done, basically. But I'm also at a campus of 36,000 people who are students, and the good thing about the campus is having an active student group as well that can facilitate a lot of the conversation. That's been useful. Reaching out to other communities, API communities especially, API directors at different sort of schools of knowledge at Berkeley, and telling them about our existence has been also critical to the process, But by no means am I sort of reaching 100%, of the students that I should be serving. But it's sort of a growing and daily challenge, I would say. So hopefully we get there.
So I know the question wasn't addressed to me, but I want to add something to that. I think also the part of the expansion of the like asking more of institutions is also being like not being afraid to ask for more, or like ask more of institutions, or if they're doing something wrong, like making noise and recognizing that they are not. I know Harvard had just pulled up their website for like undocumented students, but it is not as effective as UC Berkeley's. Like, so like just because they have a website doesn't mean that they are done with their job, you know, or like just. So I guess I'm one of the ones making noises on those things, but like I am unhappy with what they have established so far. It is insufficient. And just letting you know, just because we have a website or just because we hired one lawyer doesn't mean that the job's done, and it's far from being done.
Hello, my name is Adrian. I'm a doctoral student. I am not undocumented, but my Guatemalan father was, and my Puerto Rican mom's citizenship might as well be non-existent as the current situation stands. So with that performed disclosure, I'm curious about this comment of that Medhin, you posed of it's not our job to educate, that there are other pressing concerns. And so I'm particularly interested in that for the ways in which activism is related to knowledge production, and activism not as something that we academics use as vultures for our own kind of forwarding our own careers, but actually taking the place of knowledge production itself, especially around talks of radicalism and what it means to inhabit these types of spaces. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about that, especially given that mental, financial, and physical well-being are intimately tied to these things, right? How is it that we continue to rely on student activism when they have to worry about grades, right? And so whose job is it to really do this? And who's getting the financial packages to be able to do this, right? So I'm just curious about those comments.
I'm gonna clarify. I'm not sure about the American situation, but I'm gonna clarify what I meant when I said it's not my or our job to educate. What I meant is, and I used to do that. I used to always try to explain, but I felt like I was playing in defense all the time, and it got me to nowhere. Just tired. That's it. No, it's true. I'm not a jokester. My thing is to educate myself, to get all the information possible about my specific situation and then about the general situation. By doing that, first I secure my safe space, right? And then I can actually work as an activist, in my case, and spread the word in so many ways. Some ways she talked about, and then I can get to people that maybe are not. It's not their thing to be outspoken, or they maybe are scared, or maybe they don't feel safe enough to, but you can reach them by even just very simply word of mouth, or by putting the information out on a flyer, whatever it is, That's what I meant. I want to play in the attack without attacking anyone. Just just knowledge is I don't want to, but knowledge is the power actually. Because you go to Italy for bureaucracy is the worst place in the world. It's a labyrinth. It's insane. But and so you will find most people that they don't know what they're doing in their job. They don't have the information, and they should. So you have to have the information, because only like that you will be able to say, okay, this is not correct. I'll tell you what to do. Just sign whatever you had to sign. That's what I meant.
I have a follow-up question. When I was doing research in Italy, one of the things that kept coming up, and I'm not sure if Maurice and Medhin can comment on this, was that tiredness from the activists. So particularly those who, Medhin, you mentioned how a lot of the second generation activists then turn into refugee activists because there was yet another crisis, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on how, as an activist and in your community, you're seeing this play out, this tiredness that Adrian was talking about, but also this sense that you have to do it because there's no one else that will do it. And I think all of us at Harvard are feeling that, not just the students, the faculty of color. I think Genevieve and I are exhausted. Just literally time for sleep. Like this idea that there's always another crisis, but that the same people who are being oppressed are being called upon to take care of this new crisis, right? So I'm wondering how you see that in Italy when the second generation situation has now been resolved, but then you have this avalanche of refugees coming in and falling into you guys.
Yes,
and maybe
because you find yourself, you have to balance different kind of situation, right? Then you find yourself as being the type of profile person that can help the most in a specific situation. Maybe because you speak certain language, right? Or maybe, and at the same time you have, the territory, and you have the links with the people in the municipality or the government. You know how to speak to these people, to both sides, and you actually can be almost a lawyer, or sometimes a nurse, sometimes a therapist, and you actually find yourself wearing so many hats. He moved. And that's about it. Yes, it's tiring, because activism is not a career. That's not my job. I do something else to pay my bills. That's for free. That's for volunteer work. And it's actually a sacrifice. Nobody will ever say thank you. When the law will change, when the result, when we get the result, we will not get the accolades, the recognition. Who cares? I only care that it gets done, right? Whatever it is, it gets solved. And yes, it's tiring. I didn't mean to become an activist. I just meant to connect with people that were like me in my situation, not so much that look like me. Otherwise, I would have gone connected to the Eritrean kid. I didn't, I mean people who think like me, transversally, and that approach the situation in a specific way with a certain attitude. And it's tiring. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop.
Can I also just add something? Yes, we feel very tired all the time as well. We work in a situation where there are crises all the time, right? Shipwrecks happening every other week. And it's also, of course, a strain on mental health and all these issues. If some of our members had to inform relatives that people have drowned. And I think there's a danger, right, that in some ways, the state is going on the attack in terms of border control, and it is pulling back in terms of humanitarian, whatever kind of aid, and also what you would sometimes imagine to be very basic state functions, right, like Coast Guard services and so forth, and providing, search and rescue operations. And that now a group of volunteers, who do not earn any money from it, have to do that kind of work in their free time. I feel there's also risk. And we also see all these humanitarian actors now, which in some ways allow, of course, state actors to pull even further out because someone is doing the job. And, doing actual search and rescue operations at sea are really expensive. So a lot of the money that civil society is generating goes into humanitarian work that previously, in certain episodes at least, some states and the European community has done, right? So I think that there's a danger that now a lot of volunteers are replacing state structures also throughout Europe, all the systems that have popped up to actually do the very basic work, welcoming refugees, even sometimes doing the bureaucratic work, providing first care, aid, and so forth, and now it's now being done by volunteers. So I think, in some ways, it's a tactic also by the state, right? People are getting tired and exhausted and burnt out. So for us, the only way really to deal with that is, to form a strong collective, right? And we are a really strong collective. And I just got back from Italy last week. And, meeting all these people, we were like 70, 80 people. It really gives you new energies, and you see why you are actually doing that in the first place. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have a reception following in Emerson Hall. Robinson Hall, great space. Thank you. Arthur was about to correct me right now. But first, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you for coming. This was a wonderful conversation.